So I'm like all of you. I fell in love with dance. Um, I'm absolutely no different than you. But the reason I got into the history of it uh, was because, first off, I was already into the old styles of music long before I started dancing. Um, Not just swing music, not just jazz, but Western swing, blues, rockabilly, jump blues, rhythm, and just any old music. I loved it. And I'm born and raised in Los Angeles, so I was able to obviously go out and see these bands every night of the week, multiple places to pick to choose from. So we followed the bands. Where was the cool hangout? Which spot? Where's everybody going to be? You know. So it was a very much of a social gathering or a social scene gathered around this. What I guess we would call it roots American music. Um, and but then later on, I discovered the dancing aspect of it. And one thing that got me really interested into the history was the fact that I had only heard of like the Ken Burns version of the history of jazz, basically. Ken Burns is a very famous documentation person. He did the history of jazz, which is like a 10 DVD set. He did the history of baseball. He did like the Civil War. He has a huge amount of money to be able to put together incredible jobs, documentaries. But my point of the Ken Burns version is the history of jazz is like the only thing we're ever told or we hear is it's born in New Orleans, it went to Chicago, and then it ended up in New York. That's it, you know. And of course, as you guys probably know, in the Ken Burns documentary, he did interview people like Norma and Frankie as well, which is super good. Um, but then I started to meet these people who did this dance called the Lindy Hop, and then I started to hear this other interesting thing that was like the swing dancing uh, started with the Lindy Hop, or you know, and then the rest of the America followed, or something to that weird, something like that. And here I am in Los Angeles, and I have a friend right here next to me that's 90 years old, and he's never even been to New York. He doesn't even know. He never did the Lindy Hop. He doesn't, you know. They did their own dance, you know. And then I met another person from another city, and again, they're born during the teens, and they do their own dance in their own city, and another person, and you know. So right off the bat, I was like, there's something interesting, not correct, being told about the history of this dance, or of dance, I should say. And so it didn't take long for me to discover, you know, a couple books and a couple professors that have done outside of research from this mainstream narrative, um, and uh, and so that's what started my journey, just being purely just curious. As a dancer in Los Angeles back in the 90s, of course, as I mentioned, we have a lot of old timers dancing amongst dancers from like the swing era. And one of those dancers that many of us was influenced from, and I'm sure you've heard their name many times, is most of us teachers. He was an inspiration for a lot of us teachers, especially with not only him as a person and what he brought to the dance, but also like his moves and variations. We still teach him today. He was such a, and I'm talking about Howell Tekir. And when I met Howell Tekir, Howell was born in where he was more or less, I'm not sure exactly where he was born, but he was raised as a young child as a dancer in Redondo Beach, California. Well, I lived in Redondo Beach, California as a little kid as well, just a couple blocks from where he lived, you know. And the pier at Redondo Beach is called the Horseshoe Pier. It's a very famous pier because it's shaped like a horseshoe. And I mean, that's a place I hung out as a kid, as a skateboarder, as a surfer, you know. That's where you hung out, was the pier. That's where you smoke weed and you meet your friends, you know. Well, there used to be a huge ballroom right at the base of the pier called the Mandarin, which is no longer there. I never knew there was a ballroom there, of course, but but coming to meet Hal, I was like, wow, I felt a special connection. Like, that's my street. Wow, you used to go to the Fox movie theater? Really? It's a small movie theater, quite well known, but it's a small one, and so it's more or less like art film type of a theater. That's where they would show like all the surf movies, Endless Summer, smaller, not big budget movies, but smaller. But back in the old days, it was a mainstream movie theater, and that's where Hal would go to watch movies and like try to steal dance moves. The most famous story, of course, is Day at the Races. So I felt this special bond with Hal, being from Redondo Beach, and he was called what's called a jig trot dancer, and so that was my special. I felt like, wow, this is part of my world, my culture, or whatever, right? And so from there, it just kind of trickled and got my interest expanded, and then pertaining to Los Angeles area and the history of California was the fact that I discovered quite quickly that jazz was actually in California very, very early on. And as a matter of fact, the term jazz comes from California. It was, and the interesting thing about this is this was all, a lot of this information was all very newly discovered in the 90s. And since the 90s, even more has been discovered. So like research and stuff popping up is still happening to this day. And thanks to the internet, of course, it's made it much more accessible for people to actually dedicate their lives spending way too much time in the basement reading old newspapers. And I mean, I still do this a lot today. And yeah, it's a weird habit, but so the term jazz, yes, it was I can't even get the order right anymore, but it was used in Northern California, then it was used just out of Los Angeles, and I'm talking about like 1911 to 1914 time period, and it was used by commentators and journalists to describe the pitcher throwing a baseball, putting jazz on it. And then of course how it got from there to Chicago and applied to the music is just is a whole nother story. But one of the things I discovered as well was the fact that in San Francisco, during the turn of the century, there was a really happening scene in San Francisco. And there was a neighborhood in San Francisco called the Barbary Coast, which is a few city blocks of Broadway, Pacific Avenue, and so forth, which was all black-owned businesses, bars, clubs, bands, music, and dancing. And that's, of course, where a dance became very famous called the Texas Tommy Swing Dance. And it was called the Texas Tommy Swing Dance in 1910. But it was, the 1920s was the big shift to Los Angeles from San Francisco as people moved to the south. And as well, they moved from San Francisco east to Oakland, California. And so the interesting thing about the Texas Tommy Swing Dancers was that they were, there's actually one clip of Texas Tommy dancing on YouTube. That's pretty interesting to watch. But the interesting about the book, if you're really interested in the subject matter, there's a book called Jazz on the Barbary Coast. And it's by a gentleman by the name of Tom Stoddard, who's a professor at, I'll think of the name in a minute, but Jazz on the Barbary Coast. And it's a real eye-awakener on the incubation of jazz and jazz entertainment, such as Cakewalk, and the influence of what San Francisco had on it and California had on it. On a side note from there, like I said earlier, as far as Los Angeles goes, one of the interesting things is like people like Jelly Roll Morton, who, while being the self-proclaimed inventor of jazz, while there is no one person that did exactly invent jazz, it was obviously a collective, a lot of people that all had their own inputs. And Jelly Roll Morton usually gets credit for being the first real composer of jazz, if anything. I actually lived in his childhood home, as you know, for a number of years in New Orleans. His connection to Los Angeles is also really interesting due to the fact that he went out to LA. I mean, if you know Jelly Roll Morton's story, read everything you can about Jelly Roll Morton because he's such a character. He was a Creole musician, obviously came out of New Orleans. He got kicked out of his house, which was around between 1902 and 1904, which is the house that I was living in, when they found out he was playing piano at the whorehouses as a young boy. Yeah. The thing about the Creoles was, and most of the people of French descent as well in New Orleans, was they were very educated in music. And one of the things that kind of one of the typical goals for a musician in New Orleans of that caliber was to eventually be able to play at the opera house or one of these higher education type of performance houses. But to a lot of these musicians, they found other ways, different ways of making money, let's just say, and Jelly Roll, Ferdinand discovered, I think was maybe 10 to 13 years old, somewhere in there as a young boy. He found out by playing piano in the whorehouses you could make much more money. And they gave him the term the professors, because it wasn't just about playing music, but you had to tell stories. And you had to, I mean, his Library of Congress recordings from 1938 are quite incredible, where they just gave him a bottle of whiskey. And I think it was whiskey. I might be wrong on that. It might be bourbon. But and they just cut him loose in front of a recorder, and he just talks, and plays music in the background half the time. Sometimes it's just fascinating recordings to hear Jelly Roll Morton, his stories, let's just say. But anyways, he left New Orleans, and then of course he traveled America. To make a long story short, ended up in Los Angeles, and there he met the Spike Brothers, and he had a dance. He ran a dance in just outside of Los Angeles. And I finally found the location of the place, which took me a long time, because they covered everything up with freeways and modernization and progress, they call it. But he had a dance, which was super fascinating. And of course, because it was outside of the city limits, there was and during Prohibition, during the very early 20s, 20, 21, 22, somewhere around there, it had a couple different names. Watts Country Club was one of the names, but it wasn't in Watts. It was just across the border. So anyways, it was hot jazz, booze, and dancing. And it was all ethnicities dancing together. And some of the bands he had play there, most famous would be, let's see, King Joe Oliver's band, which of course is just a powerhouse band out of New Orleans. We know his music because of his countless recordings from 1923. So that kind of gives you the idea of the tempos they were dancing and the different types of music they were dancing to. And obviously this is way before any type of swing dancing was invented, so to say. So it was very curious to know how they danced to that music, socially anyways. And so this really is where I got my foundation on research. And as far as like the New York aspect, I had really good friends already researching New York history. Like the most well-known person to research the Savoy Ballroom, for instance, would be Terry Monahan from London. Unfortunately, Terry died, but he taught me a lot about research. He taught me a lot about the academic side of the fence, which I'm not from at all. And so he was a really big help in even though we helped each other, we were hand in hand, because I had a different goal and different topics of what I was curious about, and he had different goal and different topics, and he was purely on the Savoy Ballroom. So like anybody that ever danced at the Savoy, went to the Savoy, worked at the Savoy, hostesses, bartenders, anybody, he interviewed them. Nobody knew as much about the Savoy. I mean, he knew more about the Savoy than Frankie. Put it that way, yeah. And of course he's also the one that introduced me to Sugar Sullivan and Barbara and some of the Mamalou Parks dancers, because they had the London Lindy Hop Festival in the 90s with co-partnership, I think, with Simon Selman. And it was in Acton in West London. It was a huge, nice event. But he would bring in a whole different scene of Savoy Ballroom people that the world doesn't really know. We are all probably know each other because of Frankie and what Frankie has done, because he's kind of the king. He was the, Frankie doesn't need to be. He's just the king, and his traveling around the world and spreading the dance has caused this scene to become international. Single-handedly by him, I mean, no question about it. But Terry started bringing in the people like Sugar Sullivan, the third generation Savoy Ballroom dancers, and then of course the Mamalou Parks dancers and Dickie and all these people. So you're meeting a whole different generation of dancers from the Savoy Ballroom, and even post Savoy Ballroom. So you started to get such a different, rich, rich history, and learning how diverse and mixed it is, and how people don't even know about the other people so much because they're too busy focusing on their own lives and their own things, And this kind of gets into like the quote unquote jitterbugs or the swing kids, whatever you want to call them. They were absolute swing addicts to the point where they knew more about the big bands than the actual big band leaders. Case in point, like Artie Shaw. I met Artie Shaw a couple times because he lived in Los Angeles, and like Artie was like, he said stuff like if you wanted to know where, where's Benny Goodman going to be, or where's Count Basie going to be, the person to ask is the front row jitterbugs. They'll tell you, because they know where everybody's playing, when they're going to play. And so it's just a really interesting kind of concept on that whole thing. So, being from, as mentioned, from Redondo Beach myself, that's where I started school anyways, before I moved to Palos Verdes for a short time, and then I lived in San Pedro. My grandmother, she lived on Balboa, so I grew up on the beach at Balboa, right down from where the ballroom used to be. I got pictures on my Instagram I occasionally post. Baby pictures, which me pointing to the pier as a small baby and stuff. But over the pandemic, oddly enough, when nobody was really dancing except for those on posting videos of dancing in parks and so forth, nobody was out teaching anyways. Very few people were. Even though I was in Sweden and we never had lockdowns. I got a lot of I had people contacting me, and I had the most peculiar conversations with people. And one of those conversations was, they asked me about, okay, my family, they lived in Balboa and blah 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 blah, and they asked me, do I feel how does that make me feel that people are doing Balboa now all over the world, or more or less in Europe and blah blah, and am I offended by that? Do I feel that they stole it? And they're going down this weird pathway of questions, and it made me ponder a lot. And and of course, one of the things was, do you feel that the culture was appropriated? That was one of the big ones too. Do you feel that the Balboa culture has been appropriated? And I mean, right off the bat, I could say, well, no, because nobody appropriated any culture. They took the dance, the steps. They left the culture behind. And even if they wanted to take the culture, they couldn't. It's impossible. It doesn't work like that. And then it's like, well, what is Balboa culture? Well, that's a good question, because obviously, even if it is the same exact identical dancers I might be dancing next to, like Ed and Inez, for instance, they're not the same people or living in the same world as they were in the 30s. It's a completely different time, So cultures change. They're not necessarily, 30s culture is completely different than the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s. Even if it's the same people, and even if it's the same group of people. I mean, their alcohol prices has gone up. They're now driving in cars and not taking the public transportation. And now they're well-to-do. They have money. There could be a lot of different variations. It's a really silly topic to ask, to be honest, to compare a culture from 80 years ago and expect it to be the same today. But the question was, so then what is actually Balboa culture? Well, Balboa culture would be, if there was, I guess, such a thing, obviously it would be dancing in Balboa, number one. And then number two, it would be purely social. It would be nothing performance about it, and at all. Number three, that means you're obviously primarily dancing with obviously the opposite sex, and you're obviously looking. Might not be the right word for everybody, but you're open to a relationship, and you don't change partners like we do today. Of course, you will change partners after so many dances, but once you find someone that you click with, you stay with that person, and it's not necessarily based off on ability level, as the pure Balboa people in the room know. You can dance with somebody that might be, upper beginner, intermediate, and it might be the best feeling connection you ever had in your life. Whereas you might dance with another teacher, let's just say, and it might not really click. I'm talking about pure Balboa, just the old-fashioned original Balboa shuffle. It's a body-to-body thing, and you're just, and the reason you're there in the first place is because you love the music. So the music is what brings us all together. That's first and foremost. Second comes the dance. Find somebody to dance with, and you ask somebody to dance. It clicks, boom, and then you stick with that person because it feels good and the music's good, and it's a relationship you've created. And then once you get married, you have babies, and then you dance with your wife or your husband for the rest of your life. 60 years. That would be Balboa culture. That is Balboa culture. And so if you want to think about it, maybe it could be said that it's a good thing we didn't appropriate the culture. You know what I'm saying? Because I get to rotate all that I want now, and and I don't have to stay in closed position. I can open up, and I can show off if I feel like it. So we're not abiding by these strict rules that used to be unwritten rules that used to be. But I wanted to bring up a story that happened in the '90s in Los Angeles, and to kind of capitalize on this subject a little even more. Obviously, most of you know Los Angeles gang life a little bit, probably from the Hollywood movies, and probably the most notorious gangs we have in Los Angeles are the Crips and the Bloods. If you don't, okay, fine, that's good for you. It's a good thing maybe you don't know. But Crips are a gang, a black gang that range in a certain area of Los Angeles. I won't get too into to the details of it, but like Snoop Dogg and his friends, they're all Crip gang. North Long Beach, Compton, Watts area, and the Crips, they have this certain step thing they do solo, while they're hanging out on street corners and garages and just hanging out amongst each other. It's a little solo. I'm going to call it a solo dance for now, just to get the point across. They don't call it that, but it's just a little solo thing. It's a little shuffle step, but they're able to. You could Google this information and YouTube it, but they're able to basically the way they Crip walk or C walk. It's basically just a big. It's a gang sign. Let's just say. By the way people Crip walk, you can tell what neighborhood they're from. So it has its own vernacular, and they can write with their feet, and so you actually know it's pretty intense, right? You can imagine, right? Well, it got to be a point where in Los Angeles in the early '90s, in the schools, all the high schools, they banned the Crip walk, which made me chuckle as a dance historian, because you're like, oh, they tried to do that to the Charleston, they tried to do that to rock and roll, they tried to do that to and so what happens with the Crip walk, the C walk, is the hip hop dancers, regular hip hop dancers, top rockers, right? They saw the C walk, and they thought it was the coolest little step footwork they had ever seen, so they took the step and put it into their hip hop dancing. Well, obviously there's a problem now. Now you have a bunch of innocent dancers, actual dancers, innocent as can be, being attacked for doing the C walk. So now the Crips are taking it out on these guys and shooting them and whatever. And the poor dancers, they don't know, hey. So what they started doing was they started painting their faces like clowns, because the Crip walks, the C walkers, they were calling them C walk, not Crip walk, but clowns. Clown being a derogatory term. It's like you're just a clown, your steps are meaningless. It's just comedy, you're worthless kind of thing. So then the dancers said, okay, we're clowns. So they started painting their faces like clowns, just so they would be obviously not gangbangers and not get shot at, right? Well, interesting to note, one of the interviews they did, there's a documentary, I don't remember what year it came out, but 20 some odd years ago, maybe a little more. It's called Sea Walk LA. And one of the Crips that they interview is a very, very famous Crip, and his name was Ghost, and he demonstrates it on video and stuff. He's dressed in his blue, everything's blue, just so you guys know they only wear blue, and it's different subject, but of course he's wearing a bandana over his face because he doesn't want the police to know that he's doing videos, interviews for film, and what he says in his interview is very interesting, because he goes, the sea walk, it's a way of life, and here comes these clowns, and they take it and they turn it into a dance, and that was a very deep sentence right there. They took their way of life and turned it into a dance. And I thought that was peculiar for a couple of reasons, because that's exactly what happened to Balboa. Now, the difference is this. Obviously, with Crip Walk, with the clown dancers, they didn't want to appropriate the culture. That's drug wars. That's street violence. That's killing each other because they live on the wrong street, blah, 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 blah. So there's a perfect example of where you take a dance, but you don't want the fucking culture. You can keep your culture. We just want the steps, And to me, that's a kind of a little bit, you know, maybe not as drastic, obviously, but it's a little bit of an example of how a dance step like the crip walk was taken from the gangbangers, and it became a universal, if not international, step now in hip hop. I'm sure you could probably talk to any great hip hop dancer in any metropolitan big scene, and they would know what it is. So from the streets of LA to, if not, you know, internationally, everybody knows what a little bit of sea walk is, you know. And of course, when you, not that it doesn't hurt, but you have these huge tours, hip hop tours, I call them, or rap tours of multiple big names, like Snoop Dogg, for instance, West Coast Connection, and all that stuff. And of course, they're doing their little sea walk on stage and stuff like that. And that's of course on DVDs. Now it's on YouTube. And so you have kids all over the world imitating and taking it and turning it into a step, you know. But the point of the story was more or less what Ghost had said about the people taking his steps and turning it into a dance. And I do feel that there's a little bit of similarities to that with Balboa. We've taken the step from Southern California, and now it's a dance. And by that we mean, of course, that you're learning it in studios, and we're spreading it in a different way. And and I think it's a good thing. I think it's a very positive thing. It's amazing. I mean, it's true that it's not the same anymore. Of course, you know, I rarely see people do Balboa as it was done by the old timers. As far as the actual Balboa, nowadays Balboa is usually a blanket term for all of the bal and all of the swing and everything that came out of Orange County and Los Angeles, which of course is historically incorrect. But so what? You know what I mean? It's like, what's the damage being done? You know, it's easier to teach lessons like that, and that's just how it works. You know, you don't get to always pick and choose the terms that stick or the terms that don't stick. You know, it's so, you know, you can cry all you want about it, but no, it's much more beneficial to have the dance be known and spread. And the fact that people are even using the term is shocking to these old timers, because it wasn't that long ago. I mean, it's 2003, so like 23 years ago, Maxi Dorf would not even believe that there's enough people doing his dance that there could be a contest based on a swing. He was like, he was living in Las Vegas, of course, where he retired, and he's one of the great Los Angeles, I would call him a rhythm dancer. And I mean, I guess he's kind of the self-proclaimed king of bow swing, which is rightfully so. Between him and Willie argued about this, who's the king of bow swing. But they both didn't do Balboa. They did swing, bow swing. Using the steps, they turned it into a different dance, using turns, spins, and cool stuff, and also mixing it in with their Lindy stuff, you know. So it's just part of this evolution and progress. Maxi didn't dance the way we saw Maxi dance as an old timer, was nothing like he danced in the 30s. But the only reason I know that is because I knew his partner in the 30s, Mary McCaslin. And when I asked her about Maxi's moves and his steps that Maxi did, this one I got from Maxi, or what did Maxi do? And she would be like, well, he never did that, or he da. You know, you hear, you know, the old timers are rather blunt sometimes. And good dancers are never stagnant. Good dancers are always progressing. And so whether you're a Frankie Manning or a Dean Collins or a Al Mims or whatever, it's like they didn't dance the same way as they did in the 30s as they did at the end of their lives. This is part of what I learned through research. It was really fun and cool to dig up and find the dancers who stopped dancing after World War II. So now when I talk to them and dance with them in their living rooms or whatever, I could get an unfiltered version of how they actually danced and compare that to the good dancers who continue dancing their entire lives. And so I had this thing to contrast everything on. And I thought that was really interesting. So the same thing kind of goes, so when it comes to these dances, it's just this, it's a very peculiar concept to think that anybody could actually own a step or a dance, especially in swing, what I would consider swing culture. And what I mean by swing culture, I should say swing dance culture. And my go-to information for swing dance culture is just all of those that were alive and dancing during the swing era, whether they were in Los Angeles, whether they were in New York, not just necessarily Harlem, but also Lower Manhattan or even Brooklyn, or St. Louis, for instance. And there is a common denominator, and the common denominator is do the step once, it's magical. Do it twice, and it's educational. Which means your steps will get stolen. You know, and so for the good dancers that wanted to protect those showy steps and those really cool moves, they would do it once. That's it. They would never do it twice in a row, because then everybody would steal it. And I really hated that word steal. And Frankie Manning, he used that word steal. And I even argued with him a little bit about it, or asked him, questioned him on his use of the term, because even though Frankie would steal steps from whoever and anybody, if you dance near Frankie Manning and you did something cool and he wanted it, it's his. He's taking it, you know. But the thing about Frankie was he never claimed it to be his. He always gave credit to where he stole it from, right? And so for me, I was like, yeah, but isn't that more or less like kind of borrowing it? And then he would laugh, ha ha ha, no, I stole it. Yeah, you know. And then sometimes he would change it into something else, or you know, whatnot, or nothing, you know. And so the concept of stealing steps is ingrained in that culture, and it's ingrained in dance, in American dance to this day, I would say. However, with that said, within I could think about within our swing community during the 90s, it was kind of the same thing. However, amongst our friends in the collective, some steps were like our trademark steps, and they were kind of off limits, you know, just for no other reason than that you and your partner have a certain move or step that just becomes you. But all the rest of them you have to know, you know, all the typical basic aerials. Everybody has to know all the basic aerials. That's number one. And then you have your one air step that just you do as a couple. Now that doesn't mean people can't steal it, but it's kind of an off limits thing. And if somebody does, it's, you know, then they get to steal it, I suppose. You're allowed to talk shit, you're allowed to argue, and you call them names about it, but too bad, you know, you don't own it, they don't owe you any money, you know. Everything was always settled on the dance floor. Any type of debate, argument, or whatever it might be, it was always settled on the dance floor. As soon as a real fast song came on, we clear, even if it was just a few couples, we clear the floor and battle it, you know. And we did that a lot, you guys, you know. And they were, of course, for the most part, friendly battles, but not always. There was sometimes, especially with traveling dancers coming to town, all the young kids would come out and want to battle them. Like, why is that guy famous? He sucks, you know. And I'm like, you know what? That dude's been teaching at this town, this town, around the world. They're like, I don't care, you know. Yeah, I'm serious. It was funny, but but I mean, that was part of the LA culture that the old timers handed us down, and the old timers, they continue doing their battles and their jams too, you know. So. I guess that would be a part of the culture I miss a little bit in the Lindy community and swing scene, whether it's the bow scene, the Lindy scene, or the shag scene, is that you know, there was battles, and the battles have to do with egos, of course, more than anything else, which is healthy and fun, and you know when you've been beat, you know, and you'd be like, okay, you got me tonight, I'll get you tomorrow night, you know. And you go home and you practice, you know, you have your steps. But because we don't have so many, I think we lack a lot of the partnerships and training that used to be normal. A lot of us come to events by ourselves or with some friends. We're more into it just socially. Whereas back in the day, just in my time, and again, we didn't invent this. We literally did what we were told from the old timers. Like Hal and Betty, for instance, you know, you dance every day, you practice every day, you practice your moves every day is what you practice, and you make a list of all your moves. Let's say 20. This is what Hal did, and this is what we did as well. You have your 20 different show moves, competition or whatever you want, performance moves, air steps, whatever, right? And then you have your 3 entrances and 3 exits. Well, you practice that whole list every single day. And then when you show up at a contest, you pick 3 or 5 moves from your list. You pick your entrance and you pick your exit. And that's based off of who you're dancing at, who your competition is. and that's it. The rest of it's just all lead and follow, just regular, regular dancing. But that's how serious they took their dancing. And why did they take it serious? Because dancers in the 30s, regardless of where you lived and regardless of your ethnicity, you were poor, usually dirt poor. And you have to remember, they're dancing through their shoes. And if you want to, parents aren't going to sit there and buy you new shoes every 2 or 3 weeks. Hell no. You want to buy shoes? Go get a job. And so kids are working at 15, 16 years old and getting in these contests, all the time. And I'm talking about like $5 contests. That was good money back then for a young kid to win a contest. So they were competing for a reason, so they could buy new clothes, because they were ruining their clothes dancing, or ruining, going through their shoes. You had a lot of swing couples, as corny as this may sound, their moms would make them outfits, matching outfits, like sewing machine, like literally, a perfect example is Freddie and Betty Christopherson, from the video I posted on YouTube from, I think, 1936 or 37, and it's a little campy, of course, but the reason is it's affordable, making clothes. They're poor, So, anyways, getting into that jam session mentality culture, that's kind of the missing thing today. But we don't live in the same, atmosphere necessarily. There was a time around 2003 and 2004 when a lady by the name of Janice Wilson, who's from Harlem, she was teaching a lot, internationally teaching. And she would teach in harangue and stuff, and so she did her best as well as I did back at that time to get jam sessions, like motivate people to get into jam sessions and stuff. But it doesn't really spill over. It's hard to explain. The concept of one-upmanship is something difficult to teach, and you can encourage it all you want, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. That's just how cultures are in different cities and different countries, and so it's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing at all. Like I said, I liked it. I thought it was cool, and it inspired the beginners. To me, I thought it inspired the beginners to really want to go home and practice more, But then you'd have these dances at a studio would have a dance, a Wednesday night dance, open to all ages, and it would be like, just to give you an example, no alcohol. They got tea and coffee and cookies, and they got a little band, and then the person in charge would get on the microphone. Okay, everybody, clear the floor. We're gonna have a spontaneous jam session. Let's get the beginners in there. Which defeats the whole purpose of a jam session in the first place. So that's studio culture, and when studio culture meets this culture, it doesn't always overlap. And people call studio culture different names. All kinds of different names, let's just say, and I don't think they're the proper names for it, but studios serve a certain purpose. And when I say studios, I'm talking about the classic studios, that teach ballroom, that teach ballet, and then they have a swing department. Now we're going to teach the Lindy Hop, And again, there's absolutely zero wrong with it. The point is getting people to dance, and like all the old timers said, if everybody was dancing, if we could get all of our world leaders to start dancing, we'd have half the world's problems solved, So there's absolutely nothing wrong with these two different cultures, even if they don't overlap all the time perfectly. So with that said, one of the things also that I wanted to bring up, and it's a story that I've basically have told countless times, usually at the very end of a talk I do, when people start asking me questions. And one of the things they will ask is, if you had one thing that the old timers taught you, what would that be? Kind of a thing, right? And that's, of course, a difficult thing, because there's so many individual old timers, each one of them sharing something very, very special to me that I will hold dearly for the rest of my life. But as a collective, the one thing that really sparked my curiosity was, as I said, like the first time walking into Golden Sales, which was a bar, hotel, club on Pacific Coast Highway in Long Beach, California. Walking in there for the very first time, it was like walking and witnessing the Fountain of Youth, where I'm seeing all of these dancers in their 70s and 80s and maybe even 90s, and but they're all acting like 16-year-old little jitterbug kids, literally, like immature. Some of them were just so damn immature, but there were a huge mix of the behaviors in these people, right? So I was just shocked because my grandparents were nothing like any of you. You know, they were much more strict. So seeing this was shocking, you know. And then as I got to know them and become friends with them, like any big group of people, some of them you're going to really bond with and become really, really close, and other ones you're just going to be more acquaintances. And then some of them are just they're just there, you know. And what's up, Bill? That's it, you know. And one of the things, I mean, they were so diverse. Put it this way, like, and I'm talking people in their 70s, 80s, and even maybe a few even older. Oklahoma Al was probably the oldest. He was in his 90s. And he's the guy doing free spins, like 7 free spins. You're like, how old is this dude? Okie Al was his name. You have the old timers out in the parking lot smoking weed. Like, that's not normal. That's just not normal for how I was born and raised, right? Like, that's what the 16-year-old surfer kids did out in the parking lot at high school. But not like your great-grandparents out there, you know, talking about dance. Here, Bill, one more for you. Okay, let's go dance, you know. But then on the flip side, and like one person, for instance, George Christopherson as an example, he didn't have any money. He was broke. He was absolutely broke. And he lived in his grandchildren's garage, which was converted into like a kind of a bachelor thing. So here's a guy that's absolutely living in the bottom of society, living in a garage, broke. But here it was like a 4 or 5 time California state champion. You know, his older brother and sister were California champions in the 30s. He was mid-50s. He's part of the reason why there is such a thing as a Jack and Jill, because he would win all the contests. So nobody had a chance. So then his name was Jack Dawsey, but he changed it. I'll think of it in a second. So he was the one that came up with the idea, well, why don't we all change partners? It didn't matter. George won anyway. So. So you have these people that are like, let's just call him open-minded and broke, George. But then you had people that were super, super ultra conservative, because that's Orange County, California. That's the conservative part of California. I mean, that's where Nixon's from. I think Reagan might be from. Reagan Library might be from there. I don't remember. Or Santa Barbara. But anyways, the point is the Newport Beach, Balboa, and Orange County areas is a lot of very conservative people, right? So that was the pure Balboa, mostly pure Balboa people that just tended to be very politically conservative. But these people have all been friends, like best of friends, more or less, for well over 50 years, 60 years, maybe even more in some situations. So this diversity, it was just mind-blowing to me. Just like, wow, because I don't get along with you, and I don't get along. You guys are you're all crazy. But I love your dancing, you know. And so one of the things that one person I have to mention is Venna Archer. And Venna Archer was from Venice Beach. She was one of the original Ray Ran dancers from the 30s, which consisted of 2 couples, then it went to 4 couples. They called them the Big Four, and then it expanded to 8 couples, 4 couples of white dancers, 4 couples of black dancers, and they were a dance troupe in Los Angeles. And Venna was just super street smart, Venice Beach surfer chick. Like, I could talk to her like I'm talking to you guys right now. I didn't have to mind my language. She understood. I've learned not to use as much slang teaching the last 20 plus years in traveling. But there was a time, my language is even worse than it is now, believe it or not. And Venna understood everything. Like, we would just communicate like she's my age. She was super hip. And Venna is one of the very, very influential people in my life, knowing her, and her husband Johnny, for that matter, who unfortunately also passed away. But the thing that they said was, when you go to a dance, you walk in as a dancer. That's it. You don't walk into a dance with anything. You leave it all outside. How much money you make, how much how you vote. It's all, you leave it at the door. You walk in as a dancer. That's it. And Frankie talked about this a little bit too, but not so much in detail. Frankie was but he would say something like, when people asked him a similar question about more about the race relationships, as you guys already know from Frankie, he said that didn't matter. He's like, what he said was, the only thing they want to know is, but can you dance? That was Frankie, that's all I care about. Can you dance? It doesn't matter what color your skin is. Can you dance? Well, the LA old timers were no different. They were no different. I would say they might not even care if you can dance or not, to be honest with you. But yeah, because you're there for the music, and that's just how it was. You just leave it at the door. It's the music. It's the music. We're all here for the music because we love this type of music. And then what brings us together and makes us bond together is the connection through dancing. And that's the thing we have to focus on if you want to remain friends with everybody for the next 60, 70 years. Remember, it's the music we love, number one, and then if you want to bond together, it's the dance that's going to unify us. Because if we started thinking about what separates us, that's really, really easy to do. I mean, we can all sit here in 2 seconds and disagree on thousands of topics. But the one thing we can all agree upon here is the music. We got probably one of the best big bands on planet Earth playing for us last night, the Melody Makers. And of course, needless to say, one of the best ballrooms on planet Earth as well, Lucerna. But the point isn't about necessarily that specific band or that specific ballroom, but it's just the music in general. Big band swing and, of course, the dancing. The interesting thing is, I don't know about you guys, but when you're back at home talking to the normies at the local supermarket or whatever, how many people have heard of Count Basie? Number one, how many people have even heard of Count Basie? And then how many people of the people that have heard, because the people will say, well, I've heard of that. What is that a woman? What is a Count Basie? Or is that a royal person from Belgium? So out of the people that have heard of the name Count Basie, how many people have actually heard of the music of Count Basie on planet Earth? How many people actually like Count Basie on planet Earth? Not very many. And then how many people actually dance to Count Basie? We're about a speck of dirt on the moon. And so I think it's time we think about what unites us more than anything else, And like I said, if you want to keep doing this for the rest of your life, I mean, I've been dancing now for like 3 swing eras. If the swing era was 35 to 45, as they say, right? All right, well then I've been dancing for 3 swing eras, And many of you have been dancing think about it, we've been dancing for an oddly long time, when you think about it in that context. And the fact that we have evolved the dance a little bit, but not much. Whereas, if you think about the actual swing era, that was a huge evolution of dance, of swing dances. The Lindy Hop basically rose into pop culture from 35 to 40, and then disappeared as a term, as a name. And then it became listed as other things and so forth, And it's also a good idea to, when people talk about some of these flavors and terminologies, like, it's good to ask them, what do they mean by that? Because there's several answers, and they might all be correct, but they're completely different. And I think that's an important thing, just to get an understanding of where people are coming from when they talk about certain subjects on dance history. When somebody says, like when somebody uses the term Lindy Hopper, that's a big one for me, because it's a term, I've never called myself a Lindy Hopper. I'm not a Lindy Hopper. I'm a dancer. And I like swing dancing primarily. Lindy Hop is a dance that I like to do. And to me, a Lindy Hopper, in the most specific historical term, is a second generation dancer from the Savoy Ballroom. Not the first, not the third, the second. The third and fourth generation dancers, I don't know how loose and how much they actually use that terminology. I don't know enough of those dancers to really make that statement. But when I met Sugar Sullivan, to give you an example, who's a Savoy ballroom dancer, she won the Harvest Moon Ball in '55. When I met her, she didn't call herself a Lindy Hopper. She called herself a dancer, and she liked to swing. But on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, she was doing mambo. On Saturday nights, it would often be some kind of a theme of some type, So they were dancers, and they did a lot. But the people that did call themselves Lindy Hoppers was the Frankie Mannings, the Norma Millers, and so forth. And those were the people that were very, very young, who were born and raised in Harlem. The older generation, the generation right before them, of course, the Pauline Morrises and the Shorty George Snowden, they were the people the incubators of the dance. They were the ones, supposedly, as the history goes. Shorty George is the one that tagged it as such. But as soon as the dance gets named, that doesn't mean the dance wasn't already existing without the move that made it cross over into something new. And of course, I'm talking about the swing out, the breakaway. But the steps that were being done, well, of course those are being done. They're being done all over New York by different people. So it was the Frankie Manning zone, the young people who had basically not much to if anything, in their lives, who embraced this type of dance, who got really, really good at this type of dance, who got scouted out by the bouncer, Herbert White. Herbert White, the one who took these dancers and exposed them through gigs and through getting hired to showboat the ability of these dancers in Harlem, to the point where it became a pop terminology of where almost everybody had heard of this thing called the Lindy Hop, even if they were not doing it. So you have this, it means something different for that generation of dancers coming out of Harlem to say, I'm a Lindy Hopper. It's a very powerful thing. And yes, you are. You took something from nothing, and you've traveled America. You've reached Hollywood. You've been in the big movies. You've traveled to South America. You traveled to the UK, I think in 1935 or something. So so it means something very different to that person. And to me, that was what I would call a Lindy Hopper. Was those people right there. It's not to say they didn't do different dances, because they did. You better believe they did. For whatever reason, the Italians became really famous in New York for doing the Peabody. They just happened to be the best at the Peabody and winning all the Peabody awards in all the ballrooms. But when the Peabody entered the Savoy, like I said, now it's a Savoy dance. It just got stolen immediately, and they took it. And also, just for you got to remember, the Lindy Hop wasn't necessarily allowed in the Savoy for the first couple of years that the Savoy was open. None of the eccentric type of what we call jitterbug style dances was allowed. It's too physical, and it gets in the way of my paying customers who just want a social dance and foxtrot, one step around the ballroom. Of course, eventually won over. This was a problem across all of ballrooms in all of America, but anyways, the point is history is an interesting thing, and nobody, no one person, no neighborhood, nobody owns it, nothing, It's just a beautiful story, you could say, but you can cherry pick it and pull the good stuff out of it that unite us, like I said, and it doesn't mean you have to ignore the negative stuff, but at the same time, like, I've been asked to do some similar talks to this, and I've been doing these talks for so many years. And the thing about doing these talks in the first place was always meant to do it right before a dance, number one, and it was also meant to not only do it before a dance, but to get everybody pumped up and excited. So when we walk out of here, we're going to go grab each other and start dancing and have big smiles on our faces, So when I started getting asked to do these different topics that are more serious, I was like, that doesn't sound like a good idea. Like right before a dance. I don't want people to walk out of here like they just left the funeral. And talk about the negative things that so-and-so beat up so-and-so and so-and-so got, the police records of so-and-so, just the down and dirty aspects of history that don't belong right before a dance. There's a time and a place for it. And yes, I do those talks. Not as much as I used to, but I do those talks. It was almost 15, 20 years ago. It was an awkward position I was in where in England they have a thing called the Heritage Foundation, and all the money raised from a non-profit Heritage Foundation goes into like Black History Month, and they do these huge things on Black dysphoria dance. So it's meaning all Black dance, let's just say. So and a certain percentage of that money is allocated to American as well. And well, guess what? Me and Frankie went over there. So here I am, a white boy from Los Angeles, having to explain a little bit about the history of American dance. But because it's a subject that no one has really dove into, and dedicated countless hours of being a good researcher, knowing the old timers, getting to talk to the old timers, who I said not only are hidden in the 20s and 30s, and then they retired from that, but then having an opportunity actually to meet some of these dancers, and also having to win them over, because you have to understand, and this isn't a racial thing. This goes to all the old timers, where a lot of these people, they just don't care. Like, why are you bothering me about this old dance? Like, it's going to the grave with me. I don't want it to go. And of course, me, I was like, well, that's an absurd thought process. That's absurd, you know. But now looking back on some of those individuals, I'm like, wow, now I understand what they mean. You know, I don't agree, but I understand it. First time I met George Sullivan, he said the same thing. Sugar Sullivan's husband. He didn't want to be bothered teaching this dance. He was like, why are you bothering me about why are you bothering me about this old dance? You know, I mean, he was seriously that. He wasn't mean. He was just like, we really like the dance, and we worship you as a Harvest Moon Ball winner, and he's just like, okay, without smiling, of course. Well, show me what you got. You know, yeah. He was totally like that. Yeah, it's a story I've told in many classes where, you know, and we did a very slow, no music on. We did a slow rock, step, triple step. He's like, no. So we do it again. So we do it again, a little bit slower. Rock, step, triple step. No. Why are you decorating it? He goes, rock, step, down, quick, down, quick, down. He goes, now do it. He goes, there's no music on, so why would you decorate it? And he's talking about the triple steps. There's no triple steps, you know, but we didn't know that. We thought it was, you know. So anyways, you know, and now there's a really, really good interview, thank God, that Sky Humphreys and Peter Strong, I don't know if anybody else was involved. Sorry if I forgot their names, but they interviewed George Sullivan. It's a really good 1 hour. It's on Facebook and or YouTube. But he's a special guy, man, you know. And he was the kind of guy, he was the teacher of champions. If you wanted to win the Harvest Moon Ball dance competition, you would go to George. And so George, if you did something wrong in class, or you didn't listen, or, you know, whatever, he would walk out on the class. He would walk out on you. He goes, I'm out of here. I'm out of here. I'll see you on Friday. You better have it. And back then, you really had it. You wanted it. So you would really practice your ass off until you got it to please your teacher. Today, imagine us trying to do that today. That teacher's an asshole. I'm never taking classes from him again. Even though they mean well, and their success rate is, of course, very good. But today it's a different culture. We can't be asshole teachers, even if it's for your best good. we turn the asshole jokes into comedy. But the honesty is intentional, and it's because it's meaningful. Because we've failed so much, we don't want to see you go through the same failures, because it took us way longer to do this than what you have today, if you want it. But that's up to you to practice. So, anyways, I'm gonna have to turn this into end this little discussion and topic that I had for today. Again, it was a little bit all over the place, but I just wanted to kind of get down to the point, which I think would be kind of common sense, but in the dance world, there is no such thing sometimes as common sense, you know. Ironically, I'm a victim of it just as much as maybe a lot of you, but I really wanted to share what brought us together, what brought them together, what continues the dance today. And that, no, it's not the same as it used to be. And it never will be. It's not the same as it was last week. And sometimes it's you know, people come and go. People learn to dance, they get really good, and then they get a good job, and then you never see them at the dance again. Or classic, most of the university cities that have big university scenes, we all know their story. Dancers take a class as a freshman. By the time they're a senior, they graduate, and they disappear from the whole city scene in itself. So it's a completely this revolving thing, and no city is stagnant. Los Angeles is nothing like it used to be in the 90s, let alone the 70s or the 50s, which was just what I can focus my specialty more on, is where I'm born and raised. But due to my traveling and talking to so many old timers over the years, I get a really good understanding of how it was in many, many places. And it's very similar, if not the same. And so with that said, I want to thank Zig-Zag Studio once again this year for this amazing event that we've been here back and back and back. And thank you for instigating me to talk about this subject, because I'm not really interested in talking too much about this subject at swing events right before dances. So, but this is one of the events where it's an open-minded event. The people here in Prague are awesome, awesome, awesome people. And and Katya's kind of laughing about this because I keep turning events down on this thing. I'll talk about this, this, and this, but not that, not that, not that. And so anyways, thank you to Zig-Zag, and I hope to see everybody here next year. Thank you guys very much.